We're in this series called Team Humanity. And the reason we're talking about Team Humanity is because we believe that humanity is worth fighting for. And we believe this because the cross testifies that God believes humanity is worth fighting for. And He's called us to be humans in a hostile world. And this whole series is all about how do we reclaim our humanity in a hostile world. I would encourage you, if you've missed the first couple weeks, to tune into the Canvas app after service and catch up, because I believe this is maybe one of the most important series we've done this year. And I think it's a series that we'll need to continue to remember beyond the length of the series, because I don't know about you, but there's times I can get real discouraged about our world, our country, where it's going. There's times where I get angry. There's times where I just feel depressed about where we are. And I don't know about you, but I need to be reminded what it means to be human in a hostile world. And that's what this series is all about. If you're taking notes today in the Canvas app, you can open it up and follow along. The title of today's teaching is Into the Deep. Everyone say, Into the Deep. Into the Deep. And if you have your Bible, go to Ezekiel chapter 47, and I'll meet you there in just a moment as we talk about what it means to be into the deep. I want to go to a strange story in the Hebrew Scriptures, in a book called Ezekiel, written by a prophet named Ezekiel. And if you've read anything about Ezekiel, if you know anything about Ezekiel, then you know Ezekiel is kind of a quirky dude. If I could compare Ezekiel to any person on TV, I would probably compare Ezekiel to Drunk Uncle from Saturday Night Live. Anybody know what I'm talking about? So when I think of Ezekiel, I sort of think of this guy. He's the guy where you just don't really know what to expect when Ezekiel enters into the room. Anybody got family members like that? Thanksgiving, Christmas, you're like, I don't know what's going to happen when this person is there. Ezekiel is a little crazy. Like one time, God told Ezekiel, He said, hey, Ezekiel, I need you to take your underwear, and I want you to take your underwear, and I want you to bury it under a rock. And he did it. Right? I don't know about you, but if I was like praying tomorrow morning and I felt like God was saying, hey, hide your underwear under a rock, I might be like, I don't know about that, God. This is a little weird. But Ezekiel, he takes his underwear, he hides it under a rock, and he leaves it there. And God's like, you'll come back there at some point. Time passes, and then God says, hey, Ezekiel, remember the underwear that you hid under the rock? He's like, how could I ever forget? And so he says, I need you to go get that underwear, unearth it from underneath the soil, and now it's all dirty and moldy and gross. And he says, I want you to go and declare a message to Israel. And so Ezekiel takes his now dirty underwear and goes in front of the nation of Israel and says, look at my underwear. This is you. You're dirty like my underwear. Somebody's just going to cut that segment on our YouTube video and make me look like an idiot. But Ezekiel was this weird guy. This is Ezekiel. And believe it or not, today I want to go to the great underwear prophet. And I want to allow him to speak into our lives today. And an encounter he has with God, I believe, even echoes into our lives here in 2019. So if you have your Bible, go ahead and go to Ezekiel 47. But before we jump in there, Ezekiel 43, Ezekiel begins to experience these visions from God about a new thing that God is wanting to do, not just in Israel, but a new thing that God is wanting to do in the world. Now, it's important to understand that when this vision was written down, it was not written during a time of ease or comfort or simplicity. This was written down during a time of great hostility, a time of great turmoil, and a time of great complexity. Politically especially, because the nation of Israel was under the rule of the Babylonian Empire. And so Ezekiel, as a man of God representing Israel, is speaking this vision during a time of great hostility. And this vision that comes to him from God is more than what Ezekiel bargained for. Ezekiel chapter 47, starting in verse 1. We're going to read a chunk of scripture here. Go with me. Don't get lost in it. It starts in verse 1. It says this, the man is this angel or guide that's leading Ezekiel throughout this vision. The man brought me back to the entrance to the temple, and I saw water coming out from underneath the threshold of the temple toward the east, for the temple faced east. The water was coming down from underneath the south side of the temple, south of the altar. He then brought me out through the north gate and led me around the outside to the outer gate facing east. and the water was trickling from the south side. As the man went eastward with a measuring line in his hand, he measured off 1,000 cubits and then led me through the water that was ankle deep. He measured off another 1,000 cubits and led me through water that was knee deep. He measured off another 1,000 and led me through water that was up to the waist. And he measured off another 1,000, but now it was a river that I could not cross because the water had risen and was deep enough to swim in, a river that no one could cross. He asked me, "Son of man, do you see this?" Then he led me back to the bank of the river. And when I arrived there, I saw a great number of trees on each side of the river. He said to me, "This water flows towards the eastern region and goes down into the Arabah, where it enters the Dead Sea. When it empties into the sea, the salty water there becomes fresh. Swarms of living creatures will live there wherever the river flows. There will be a numbers of fish because this water flows there and makes the salt water fresh. So where the river flows, everything will live. Fishermen will stand along the shore from En-Gedi to En-Eglaim. There will be places for spreading nets. The fish will be of many kinds, like the fish of the Mediterranean Sea. But the swamps and marshes will not become fresh. They will be left for salt. Fruit trees of all kinds will grow on both banks of the river. Their leaves will not wither, nor will their fruit fail. Every month they will bear fruit, and because the water from the sanctuary flows to them, their fruit will serve for food and their leaves for healing." So who understands what we just read? Right? Like, probably none of us understood. I've actually never taught on this either. Last week I taught a story I never taught on. This week I'm teaching on something I've never taught on. My wife was born and raised in Christian school, and she's like, "I didn't even know this story was in the Bible." This is a unique story, is it not? And in these visions, we begin to see the future unfold, and we see what God wants. And it's not just for the Jews, but it's for all people that would one day be a part of the family of God on earth through Jesus. And so what I want to do today is I'm going to outline this vision. We're going to walk slowly through it. And there might even be times where you're thinking to yourself, where is this going? Trust me, there's a point. We're going to walk through this story, and we're going to talk about one thing this says about God, one thing it says about us, and then I'll end with a question that I cannot answer for you, but you can only answer for yourself. So let's begin to walk through the story. Now, Ezekiel is a strange guy at times, but he's an educated priest. He's someone from the religious aristocracy of Jerusalem, and he's part of the exiled people of Babylon. And he's there trying the best to serve the Lord and serve the people of Israel. But while he's there in his role, God gives him these series of visions. And near the end of these visions, from chapter 43 through 47, the focus begins to be all about the rebuilding of the temple that was destroyed when the Babylonians took over. And the temple is a big deal. To the Israelite people, the temple was a big deal because the temple was the place where people and God met. The temple was the place where heaven and earth intersected. And it was significant that one day this temple would be restored. And so there is this temple in this vision of Ezekiel, and on this Temple Mount, it's facing a direction that in this world was highly unusual. For us, we read it, and it's completely insignificant. But to the first audience who would have been hearing this vision, it would have been absolutely ridiculous what they would have just heard from Ezekiel in regards to this vision, because the temple was facing the east. I know none of you were like, "Oh my gosh, the east," right? Because that doesn't matter to you. But for every person listening, this was a big deal that the temple was facing the east, because it was believed in this day that everything in the east was bad. That the west symbolized family, the east symbolized foreigners. The west symbolized your friends, the east symbolized your enemies. The west symbolized those who God loved, the east symbolized those that God was holding at a distance. The west symbolized those who were good, and the east symbolized those who were bad. How you doing in the back, cameraman? You keeping up? All right. See, in the west, it symbolized everything that was good, but in the east, it symbolized everything that was bad. Let me put this in perspective. The west represented the Golden State Warriors. The east represented the Los Angeles Lakers. All right? The west represented those who drink black pour-over coffee. The east represents those who ruin their coffee by putting milk in it. The west represents dog owners. The east represents, I'll leave that one alone. All right. The west represents hip-hop music. The east represents all of Taylor Swift's albums. All right. So, all right. Okay. Too soon. All right. The temple faces east. And you could tell this was a big deal because maybe you didn't catch it, but when Ezekiel's walking through the vision, 5 times Ezekiel says, it's in the east, it's in the east, it's in the east, it's in the east. He's like externally processing. He's like, oh my gosh, the temple is facing the east. Now, if you go to 4 chapters to the left, Ezekiel 43 says this in verse 1, says, after this, the man brought me back around to the east gateway. Suddenly, the glory of the God of Israel appeared from the, say it with me, east. The sound of his coming was like the roar of rushing waters, and the whole landscape shone with his glory. So the glory of God in this vision was rising in the last place that anyone in Israel thought the glory of God would be found. And the symbol of God's presence here was rushing waters. Keep that in your mind, because when you go back to Ezekiel 47, you begin to see this vision unfold. And not only is the temple facing the east, but it says there's this stream of water that's starting to trickle from underneath the door of the temple. And at first the water is going towards the east because that's where the temple is facing. But then it says it makes a hard right and it goes to the south. That's interesting. Some of you are like, why is that interesting? You need a new definition of interesting, Travis. It's interesting because in Ezekiel's world, the temple entrance was in the north. So if you were coming to worship God, you would enter through the north. And when you were leaving worshiping God, you would always walk to the south. And so according to Ezekiel in this vision, this water, which is representative of the presence and life of God, is sort of showing us a trail or a path that God's people who are leaving worship are to follow. It's almost saying, hey, follow me. I'm taking you somewhere. When you leave this temple, this is where you are to go. This is what you are to do. And what happens next is so surprising because the water doesn't stay south. Eventually, it goes left to the east once again. The water, which represents the presence and life of God, begins to go in the opposite direction that anyone in Ezekiel's world would have thought the presence and life of God would have been going. Have you ever prayed for God to do something and God answered, but it was the exact opposite what you thought it was going to be? Right? It's annoying, isn't it? Like when you're like, God, I need you to do it this way. And God's like, that's cute. I'm going to do it this way, though. Right? And this is what's happening. Ezekiel would have been thinking, like, what is happening here, God? You should be going to the west because that's where your people are. That's where the saved ones are. The west is where the good ones are. The west is where family is. The west is where our brothers are. The east is our enemies. The east are the bad people. The east are the others. The east are the foreigners. The east are those who are on the outside of our tribe. God, you should be going west, not east. God, you need to be going towards Tupac, not Biggie. You need to go to the west, God. What is going on? Is his GPS broken? Is God directionally challenged? Like, what is going on? And so with some confusion, Ezekiel, he follows the angel, and the angel measures 1,000 cubits, and the river is kiddie pool deep. You know, it's just kind of up to his ankles. Not too crazy. Still pretty comfortable. But then the angel measures another 1,000 cubits, and now the water is up to his knees. A little less comfortable, but at least I still have my control. Ezekiel had to be thinking to himself, you know, God must be kind of keeping me on my toes. He's testing me right now. Eventually this water is going to make a U-turn and go west. But it doesn't. It continues to go east. And eventually the water gets up to his waist. And even now in this moment, he's beginning to maybe feel the undercurrents underneath his feet. He's beginning to feel the ocean life underneath his feet, swim, fishing around his feet. Maybe he's going, this is a little more uncomfortable, a little more than what I bargained for, but it keeps going east. And eventually it says the water gets so high, you can imagine maybe up to his neck, and now he can't even walk in this river because the river is beginning to take him off of his feet. And then the angel is said to have picked him up out of the water and taken him to the banks. And it's on the banks that he sees that there are new trees and new plants, and there's new life beginning to burst through the soil. And these plants and these trees represent supernatural provision and healing. Now, here's one thing that you might miss in this story if you don't understand the typography of where this vision is even taking place. See, if you understand where the vision is taking place, then you would understand that the river that Ezekiel is seeing in this vision, if it went the way he said it was going, it would go through the Judean mountains and would go all the way eastward until it would drop down into the world's lowest valley, the Jordan Valley. And at the bottom of the Jordan Valley was the Dead Sea. To give you an idea how deep that drop was, it's 4 times the height of Niagara Falls. So it's the lowest point. It's the lowest place on the entire earth. And God says, this river, it's going there and it's crashing down into the Dead Sea. And in this vision, you see that the Dead Sea, which was originally, what? Dead. It's not a trick question. All right. The Dead Sea all of a sudden becomes an alive sea. All of a sudden, there's fish, so much so that fishermen can get as much as they want, and there's plants and trees, and it's this picture of restoration and renewal. Because as the man who's leading Ezekiel says, he says, where the river flows, everything will live. This vision is beautiful, isn't it? It's beautiful and it's mysterious. We can admit that much. The question is, why does it matter? Like, why does it matter for us if we're going to reclaim our humanity in a hostile world? Well, it matters because it tells us one thing about God, one thing about us, and it provokes us to ask a question that only you can answer. The first thing it tells us about God, this vision, as we lean into it and unpack, is it tells us that the love of God is always flowing towards the people and places you least expect. That the love of God is always moving towards and rushing towards the people and places you would least expect God's love to move towards. In verse 8, it says that the river flows towards the Arabah. In Hebrew, the Arabah means the Great Depression. So this river goes towards the Great Depression. God's presence and his life is flowing to the areas of Great Depression. And I bet right now, if I were to ask you, could you think of areas in your city, in this world, in our country, maybe in your own home or your job, maybe even in your own heart, can you think of any areas of Great Depression that you would be able to think of something almost instantaneously? That you know of places of great depression, places of great brokenness, places of great evil, places of great hopelessness, places of great injustice, places of depression. And what God shows Ezekiel is that there is no place and there is no person that God avoids. Come on, believers in the room. I need to know you hear me on this. See, he didn't avoid you. That's why you can wake up today with a sense of destiny, because God didn't run away from you. So I'm going to say it again, and we should be clapping with joy in our hearts because we understand with a greater gravity the reality of that statement. There is no place and there is no person that God ever avoids. There is no darkness and there is no depth that God avoids. There is no person too messy, no person too broken, no place too evil, no place too destructive, no place of injustice that God cannot come into and take a dead thing and turn it into a live thing. God doesn't avoid 6th and Market, and he doesn't avoid Billionaire Row. God doesn't avoid the drug addict, and he doesn't avoid the entrepreneur. I want you to think real quick of the person that you avoid, because we all got them. And if they're in the room right now, just point at them. Just kidding, don't do that. It's awkward. But there are people in your life that you would probably do anything to avoid. Think of the person that you would avoid right now. You would just want to get as far away from as you can. God is pursuing that person. God is pursuing that person. God is pursuing that person because there's no place and there's no person that God avoids. But the thing it tells us about us is that although there is no place or person that God avoids, what it tells us about us is that God is inviting us into the deep of that love. And God is inviting you, He's inviting me, He's inviting us into the deep of His love. If you're going to go from the temple to where life is being restored, you will have to follow the flow of the river. You'll have to allow the river to sweep you up and take you down the waterfall of grace and into the deepest and darkest places in the world. And yet this vision shows us, and it's a subtle warning, but it's there. This vision sort of warns us that you could be standing in the river and yet miss its flow. You could be standing in the river and yet miss where the river was always going to begin with. We see 4 kind of pit stops in the journey down the river with Ezekiel. You see the first one is ankle deep water. And I almost wonder if these pit stops could be understood as spiritual conditions of our heart. And if this first stop, where it's ankle deep water, was a spiritual condition, what would we call that? We call it shallow. We call it shallow faith. And you see, there are some people that are only dipping their feet into what God is wanting to do. They only have enough faith that reaches their ankles. And some people stay in ankle-deep water their entire faith journey because to go any further, to go any deeper, would require a risk. To go any further, to go into the deep anymore, it would cost you. And so there's some people who go, I'm good right here. So you know you're in shallow water when risk becomes your greatest enemy. You're in shallow waters when risk is your greatest enemy. And you should understand, deep people don't hang out in shallow waters because they know where the real action is. It's found in the deep. Ooh, there's some dating advice for somebody in this room. I talk to some people, they're like, I just want a deep man. I just need a deep man. All right, then quit fishing in shallow waters. Come on now. Because Navy SEALs aren't swimming in shallow waters. Oceanographers aren't swimming in shallow waters. Surfers aren't in shallow waters unless he's a washed-up surfer. Some of y'all are dating a washed-up surfer, and you need to go into deeper waters. Can I get an amen, people? Come on. See, ankle-deep faith. Ankle-deep faith is like the person whose faith, it's about 1.5 hours long right here on Sunday. You know, so I call it a Christian atheist. They say they believe in God, but they live every day as if He doesn't exist. So you have ankle-deep water, ankle-deep faith. This is shallow faith. But then Ezekiel continues onward in the river, and it says that the water rose to his knees. If knee-deep water is a spiritual condition, you might call this comfortable faith. This is comfortable faith. This is like the person who goes deep enough to give the illusion that they're in the river, but not so deep that they're uncomfortable. It's like the person who goes to the beach in their street clothes, right? And they go to the beach and they roll up their pants above their knees and they get in the water. You know, because they want to get wet, but they don't want to get soaked. There's a lot of people when it comes to their faith, they're like, yeah, this is good. I mean, I want to get wet, but I don't want to get soaked. You know, like I want to have faith in Jesus, but let's not get crazy with it right now. And so they sort of live with this version of faith that's it's like this illusion that they're in the deep when in fact they're not. I remember when Jen and I got married over 13 years ago, and I was about to walk out on stage with the pastor who was going to marry us. And my best man, he had breath spray, and he's like, hey, bro, take a couple hits. And I promised it was breath spray. It wasn't a metaphor. And I opened my mouth so he could spray it. I, to this day, do not understand how it happened. He missed my mouth and hit me right in the eye. And so I'm like walking out like this. I have tears streaming down my face because I felt like my eye was on fire. And Jenna walks out, she just looks beautiful, and she turns the corner, and she looks at me, and she's like, oh, Travis is crying. He's so in tune with his emotions. He just can't contain himself right now. It's so beautiful. Nope, just in pain, just in excruciating pain at that moment in time. It was all illusion. Some people just go deep enough to give the illusion that they're in deeper waters than they really are. So you'll share posts about, we need to go love people, and you'll clap at church, we need to go love people, woo! But then you're like, you know what, I'm going to do it. And so you're like, I'm going to go on Love Week app, I'm going to register for Love Week. Oh, there's a City Impact event. That's an area of Great Depression. In the Tenderloin, we should, flow over there because, God, I think, would want to pursue and is pursuing those people. That is so great. I should do that. $10 to participate? Oh, sorry, that's too much. It's knee deep. Knee deep. You see Ezekiel go further. And if waist deep water is a spiritual condition, I think we would call it controlled faith. If knee deep water is about maintaining an illusion, then waist deep water is about maintaining control. See, in waist deep water, you know that if you go any further, you're going to have to learn how to swim. And you're like, so I want to get deeper, but I really need to keep my feet on the ground. And you're starting to feel the undercurrents of love and grace pull you forward, but you're like, whoa, that's too much, too fast. I just need to keep my feet on the water, right? So what does this look like? That might look like, hey, I'm going to serve, every once in a while, but if it gets too difficult, or if I don't know, if it's too early in the day or something like that, or if it stretches me a little too much, well, I'm just going to stop serving then because I need to keep my feet on the ground. Or people that they're feeling the undercurrent of love calling them to be more generous. So you give every now and then. It's not very consistent. It's every now and then, when something special comes up. But, you're like, but I couldn't give consistently because, I got to keep my feet on the water. I got to keep my feet on the ground. Because to give consistently, that actually might cost me something. I might have to sacrifice. You join a community group because you feel the undercurrents of love inviting you to a life of community, not into a life of isolation. But you're like, but I don't want to open up to these people. I don't know them. What if they saw the real me? I'm just going to kind of keep them all at a distance. Yeah. Because, you need to keep your feet on the ground. See, you only do this as long as you still feel like you're in control. And in 13 years as a pastor, I've found this is where most Christians swim. It's like I'm in the water and, I'm feeling the movement. I'm feeling the current of grace and love. But I don't really want to give up control. I don't really want to be abandoned into what God is wanting to do. And then he continues down the river. And it goes even deeper. And now he's so deep that he can see life growing around him. He's swimming in God's presence. It's up to his neck. He's neck deep in this spiritual condition that I would call personal faith. I would say this faith where you're swimming and in God's provision, you're starting to see healing and provision. You're up to your neck and you're like, this is nice. It's so nice you could probably stay there the rest of your life and have a pretty good life. You're growing in your faith. You're understanding the Bible a little bit more. Your praying's becoming a little more natural. Like this faith thing is really starting to stick a little bit more. It's so good, but that's also the risk that it would be easy to just stay in those waters forever. But there's a sort of small warning tucked in this vision that it was a verse you probably read and went, what's that about? And then you moved on. Because it was so small. Verse 11 says, but the swamps and marshes will not become fresh. They'll be left for salt. See, a swamp or a marsh is a place in a river where the river flowed, and then it slowed, and then eventually it stopped. See, a marsh or a swamp represents someone who has chosen to benefit from the life of the river, but still refuses to go with the flow of the river. So they're just kind of like swimming in God's blessings, but their story is all about them still. The story is all about them, and they say that life leads to the deadening and sticky existence of the marsh, the deadening existence of the swamp. You have a personal faith, it's a private faith, and it sort of just stays that way. Now, when you get to the end of this vision, we have no indication that Ezekiel is sort of just being swept up by the river, like he has no choice, like he's in too deep, he can't turn back. No, we get this idea that Ezekiel could turn back if he wanted to, but there's still more to be seen. Because the angel takes Ezekiel back to the banks of the river, and he says, the water flows towards the eastern region and goes down into the Arabah, where it enters the Dead Sea. And when it empties into the sea, the salt water there becomes fresh. In other words, the angel says, look, the river is still flowing, and it's flowing to the people and places that you would otherwise like to avoid. It's flowing to the Arabah. It's flowing to the areas of Great Depression. It's going to the deepest and darkest places in the earth. And when this river comes in contact with the deepest and darkest places in the world, that which was dead now becomes alive. So the message is loud and clear to Ezekiel. Hey, Ezekiel, the only way you will see where the river goes is if you get in its flow. It is if you get in its flow and allow the presence of God and the life of God to take you into the deep. It's up to you, Ezekiel. You can go back. You can turn around. You can live your life in shallow waters. But you'll never experience a deep move of God if you stay in shallow waters. If you're taking notes today, that is an important thing to understand. You will never experience a move of God, a deep move of God, if you stay in shallow waters, because this God is flowing to the people and places you least expect, and God is inviting you to be swept up into the deep. And so here's the question I feel like this causes us to ask, but I can't answer it for you. Like, where is the river taking you? Where is the river taking you? Where do you feel the undercurrents of grace beginning to pull you? To what people, to what places, to what darkness, to what brokenness? What is your east? What is your east? We all have plenty of people in the west, but who's in your east? Where is the east for you? Where is the river taking you? In Revelation chapter 1, verse 15, it's talking about Jesus. And in Revelation 1:15, it says, his feet were like bronze glowing in a furnace, and his voice was like the sound of rushing waters. I believe the rushing waters, the voice of Jesus, is inviting humanity into the river. And Jesus is inviting us into the deep. Shallow waters may be safe, but it's only in the deep where we will encounter the provision and healing of God in this world. See, when Jesus hung on the cross and declared it is finished, some actually supposed because water came out of his wound when he was pierced in the side. So doctors have actually concluded there's a high probability that Jesus' heart literally exploded in his chest, which is why water flooded from his wound. I mean, what a metaphor for what happened in that moment. That when he declared it is finished, it was like the dam was burst open, and flood waters of grace and love and hope and miracles and restoration began to flood into the world. The river began to break free. And I love what the guide says to Ezekiel. The angel asks Ezekiel, can you see it? Can you see it? Can you see it? I think faith, in a lot of ways, is waking up to the movements and the undercurrents of grace that are happening all the time, all around you. I almost think faith is when we wake up and see, oh my gosh, the river's moving in San Francisco. Can I see it? The river's moving in my neighborhood. Can I see it? The river's moving in my family. Can I see it? The river's moving on the Muni. Can I see it? The river's moving in my workplace. Can you see it? The river's moving in your own heart. Can you see it? And here's the thing, you can't stop the river, but you can miss its flow. You can't stop what God is doing in this world. I believe that the reason Christians should be the most optimistic and hopeful people on planet Earth is because we know the end of the story. Jesus wins. Spoiler alert. He wins. He restores the world. We know where the river's going. You can't stop the river, but you can miss your role in it. You can miss its flow. You could even be standing in the river and miss where the river was wanting to take you. The river is flowing. Campus, get in it. The river is moving. Friends, let's move with it. The river is going to people and places that others are trying to avoid or exclude. But not us, because the river's going east and we're going with it. May we let the undercurrents of God's love sweep us off of our feet. And may we allow as a church family, may we allow God to take us into the deep.